we work with Rachel Yehuda, a researcher at the Bronx VA, and she's done studies of um, epigenetics of trauma. And this is sort of an explanation for multi-generational trauma. And it sounds like you may have inherited some of that, and me as well. That this, she's actually found markers on genes that it's epigenetics is what above the genes. It's what turns on certain genes. So genetic DNA evolution is extraordinarily slow over massive timeframes. But within one life, you can have these set points for anxiety, trauma that impact um, based on what's happened in your life, and then these get passed on to the children. So Rachel did a study, Holocaust survivors and their children, and identified some markers, epigenetic markers. And what she's looking at now is, can you change these markers with successful therapy, whether it's MDMA assisted therapy or any kind of therapy? If you process this trauma, will these epigenetic markers change? And I would say there's some preliminary evidence to suggest that that may be the case.
Welcome to this week's episode of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact and to shine a light on all the good happening in a world often hyper-focused on the negative. Today's episode features my friend Dr. Rick Doblin, founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick was a major inspiration for People Are the Answer, and it was a dream come true to have him on the show. Rick has worked tirelessly for nearly 40 years to legalize MDMA for PTSD treatment, among many other efforts to combat the drug war and bring healing opportunities to patients. Rick and I discuss how a trip to Russia at 16 changed his outlook on activism, experimenting with psychedelics, including at Yom Kippur services, why we shouldn't just dose the whole world, taking a 10-year break from college, his desire to be a psychedelic therapist and how that catalyzed his efforts with MAPS, epigenetics and generational trauma, why we need to keep pushing to end the drug war, and much more. Unfortunately, we ran out of time after an incredible conversation, but I hope to have him back on the show again. Here is the amazing Rick Doblin on People Are the Answer. Rick, thank you so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
It's my pleasure, Jeff, to be here with you today. And I completely agree that people are the answer, that we have brilliant minds, and we can, we don't have emotional and spiritual maturity to handle our brilliance of our minds, but people are the answer to becoming more balanced, to be able to handle the technologies that we have. So,
yeah, thank you. No, thank you for saying that. And you were certainly one of the innovators and impact I had in mind when I was starting the podcast. I've mentioned in previous episodes that, I came up with the name right after a good psilocybin experience. People Are the Answer. And I wanted to be established before I had you on. So now we're a little over 100 episodes, and I appreciate you joining.
Yeah, I'll just share one other story, which is that the executive director, I'm now the president, but the executive director of MAPS, Chris Lotlicker, did a lot of work on renewable energy for about a decade. And he ended up selling renewable energy to the largest companies like Walmart and Amazon wind farms and things like that. But overall, the problem of climate change still got worse despite all of what he did. And so what he realized is that while we do need all these technological solutions, he really needed to fix the people. And so he switched to this idea, actually, that the people are the answer. So
yes,
I think that was a good psilocybin trip you had.
Yes, that's awesome to hear. And Chris is a good friend, huge fan of his.
Yeah. But I think that's right. That's for me what sort of helped me focus my life on psychedelics, is that we need consciousness change as individuals and humanity as a whole. And that if you can do that, if you can help us feel how we're all interconnected, we're connected to nature, that all sorts of solutions can flow from that sort of core understanding, and also to help us work through our traumas and see the world more clearly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, there is that feeling that happens in certain psychedelic experiences where you just feel as one with the universe and with nature. And I often wonder, even in that state, how could we get everyone to feel this? And so that you're doing the work that takes us there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have had this sort of somewhat humorous suggestion, let's just put LSD in the water, or, let's flood the world with MDMA. But I think that misses the point, in the sense that people have to willingly approach these things. They have to be willing to change and willing to move forward. And you can't just dose people without their
Yeah.
understanding to help them come
Yes.
to these, realizations. And also that it's not just about um, the realization, but it's putting into practice. It's the integration.
Yeah.
So, for example,
Yeah.
you doing this podcast is, you could have had that insight that people are the answer and done nothing with it, and that would have been, you know, something good, but it wouldn't have turned into really impacting the world in a positive way. So it really is that idea that people have to come willingly to these experiences, and then even more, which is I think even more difficult, is try to put it into practice.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned on another podcast interview that it's not just the substance, it's the relationship with the substance. So when you mentioned dosing the world, it's so important for people to go in educated with intention when they are deciding to, utilize these substances.
Yeah, people speculate, what if we were to give MDMA to Trump? Would he suddenly become empathic to other people? Or, what if we give LSD to Putin and then he realizes we're all connected? Or, these are like, did you see, by the way, the hilarious AI of Trump getting ayahuasca?
I have not.
Oh my God, it's fantastic. It's just that, yeah, I would encourage it to everybody. Just probably just put in Trump and ayahuasca. And it turns out that he changes everything. He becomes, this shaman, and he renounces money, all this stuff. And then at the very end, it concludes with this hilarious thing. And then he says, of course, people tell me I'm the best ayahuasca shaman there's ever been in the whole world. So that kind of narcissism, egotism didn't really dissolve
Yes.
as we had hoped. But I do think that that sort of consciousness shift that we're talking about is somewhat parallel to what happened quite a few hundreds of years ago with Galileo and Copernicus, when they thought
Yeah.
that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then, as it turned out, that was very threatening to the church, and Galileo died under house arrest. But it was sort of changing people's perceptions of where we are in this larger universe. And I think we need something similar in terms of our ego, and in terms of our ego. And so what you said, this connection to everything, and this, that I think um, that we need to displace ourself as the center of the universe and become part of this larger whole. And for me, the way in which I see that very eloquently explained is in Abraham Maslow. And he was the founder of humanistic psychology, and then later in his life, the co-founder of transpersonal psychology. But many people have learned in school about the hierarchy of needs that Maslow proposed, where your survival, it's this, pyramid, and at the bottom is your survival needs, and, food and shelter. If you can't deal with that, you can't think about much else. And then as it gets up and up, it's, belonging needs, self-esteem needs, accomplishments needs. And then the top of it is this self-actualization, this idea of becoming your full self. And that's what most people are taught. But in the last few years of his life, Maslow learned a lot about psychedelics and met Stan Grof and started working with him and others. And as it turned out, humanistic psychology was sort of evolved into transpersonal psychology. And the top of the hierarchy of needs went from self-actualization to self-transcendence.
Mm.
This idea that we're
Yeah.
part of something larger. And so I think that's the kind of consciousness shift that we want individuals to make, and collectively enough of them make that, then humanity as a whole to make
Yeah.
that, to see that we're all in it together. And we have the resources to feed everybody, to have good shelter, everybody, but they're just unequally distributed
Yeah.
in ways that
Yeah,
are not.
that comes up a lot on this show. You'll find toward the end a specific question I ask where it comes up, but I believe that regardless of your political affiliation, we have the resources to get everyone to a baseline, right? And then at that point, we could then see the true potential so many people that are just having to worry every day about survival. And, regardless of sides of the aisle, I wish that we could come to terms with that and actually make that a reality.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I mean, I think that there are um, so many people that sadly we've here in America that more than half the people can't handle a $500 unexpected expense. And so when people are living on that edge of anxiety, their fears and their anxieties are what propel them more than rational thought.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And doing my own self work recently, I realized that a lot of my life I have been motivated by various fears, and that trying to realign myself and change the motivating factor is going to be healthier. It's gotten me to here. I've been able to survive up to this point, but now if I am to sort of cross a new threshold, then I need to change my motivating factor.
Wow. How did you, if you don't mind, how did you come about to realize that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's probably a a long discussion, but over years of therapy and various psychedelic experiences, I think this specific realization came in a discussion with a relatively new life coach that I've been working with. And I was looking back on my childhood and why I've made certain decisions over the years. And, I want the decisions to be rooted in love, but looking back, I could tell that many of them were rooted in fear. So I'm trying to overcome that and change it.
Wow, that sounds like a really good life coach you got.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a good experience thus far. And always trying to move things forward a little bit, try to get a little bit better every day. Um, and I'd say, I'm generally motivated to make myself better so that I can help make the world better. And starting off with my family, my kids, and the rest of my wife and the rest of my family. Um, but I often, start off in these interviews asking my guests what motivates them. And, a lot of that has come up in our conversation already, but I'm curious, when you're directly asked the question, what would you say generally motivates you?
Well, we've really you've set this up in a way really well because what I was going to say to you, and then I'll say that is that it takes a lot of courage to look at your fears to realize that because once you do that, you have to acknowledge what are you fearful of. You have to get to the root of it in order to work on it. And so, what I've been motivated by is fear. The way I think about it is that, but I've been, I would describe it as second generation fear, meaning that I had wonderful parents. I grew up in America at the height of American power. I was influenced by American exceptionalism. So, I was born in 1953, not too long after World War II. And I was, I believed this American exceptionalism. I also was the chosen people, meaning
Yep.
Jewish. Of course, everybody is chosen, but that was something. Then I was white. Then I was male, and then my family was well off. So I had all of these um, sort of advantages of privilege, you could say. But I was educated on stories of the Holocaust. As a young boy, I was in school during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the talk was, "Oh, just duck and cover, duck under your desk, and maybe you'll survive nuclear war." Um, and then, of course, for me, being in one of the last years of the lottery, so I was fearful of what humans can do to other humans
Yeah.
when we dehumanize people or when we
Yeah.
are manipulated by our fears and anxieties to create external enemies and scapegoats,
Yep.
or the enemy within, and all of that. And so what I felt was that what motivates me is the fear of um, humanity destroying itself or
Yeah.
destroying Jews or other minorities. But by wrapping that, at least I was so lucky to have that wrapped in privilege, the fear wasn't overwhelming. It was actually motivating.
Hmm.
So if it would have been, no, so my grandfather on my dad's side came over from Poland in 1920. Um, and his relatives left behind were killed in the Holocaust. I'm actually going to Poland tomorrow to try to for a psychedelic conference about trying to bring MDMA assisted therapy to Poland for Polish people with PTSD and Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And then also we're trying to do trainings in Ukraine. So for me, I've been insulated from the direct kind of traumatic experiences that might have made the fear overwhelming. But I was educated on stories that made me realize that, you know, we're only, it's not that long ago that World War II took place, and that incredible genocide, terrible genocide took. And there's been genocide since then against different groups. And so I think the fear was the motivator, but the hope was that through psychedelics and through other means, psychedelics are not the only way. I don't mean to imply that at all, but that we could feel our interconnectedness, and that could be the antidote to scapegoating and dehumanization. And that when I came upon this was 1972 at age 18. And it was after the backlash of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 and psychedelic research being wiped out. And I thought, wow, I have this privilege. What I should focus on is what I think would be the core um, consciousness shift that needs to take place, um, even though it was a long shot and even though it was suppressed. Jung has this incredible quote that is the most important political, social, and therapeutic thing we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. You know, the shadow is the
Yeah.
parts of ourselves that we disown. And so I felt that these techniques, uh, which again, psychedelics are only one of a range of techniques that can get you into these kind of experiences, that would be um, a high leverage situation to work on. And since it had been criminalized and there was really no jobs there, or things were shut down, I thought this would be a good thing for me to focus on. So it was really this idea of hope for healing and hope
Yeah.
for interconnectedness that has been the main motivator. And the fear is what's kept me focused. You know, that
Mm.
if I were to stop doing this, and stop working on these tools that can, Stan Groff also talks about the LSD as being a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious. It brings things to
Mm.
the surface. If I didn't keep working on this, we might have more of the fears and anxieties and scapegoating come to the surface. So I think that kind of sums it up for me. Is this, no, the other thing that the image that I get is that MAPS I started in 1986 on April 8th. And it turns out that the 38th anniversary of MAPS this year was the solar eclipse through the United States, through much of the United States. And so we ended up gathering together with a bunch of people from MAPS and others, many, many others outside of Austin, Texas, to watch the eclipse as it went through near that area. And so um, watching the totality gave me this kind of image that you see that the sun, this brilliant sun, warmth, light, heat, life, covered up by, um, the shadow of the moon, and that it's just darkness. So that's where I felt like I've got this fear, this darkness inside of me, but wrapped around it was this rim of brilliant white light from the sun. And that was like privileged, that the darkness didn't completely overwhelm the light. And so I felt that that's sort of a good explanation for my motivation is this kind of wrapped light. So I hope that image,
No, it is. It's a
responds to.
beautiful picture to paint, and how it all relates. And despite being 30 plus years younger, had a similar sort of experience growing up. Come from four Polish Holocaust survivors as my grandparents, being taught about those experiences as kids, and what can happen, like you said, when certain parties are used as scapegoats in the world. So that was certainly part of my fear as well. And also additionally, part of my motivation. And it's interesting the way that you paint that in terms of, our privilege is what allowed us to be motivated by it. Since we didn't actually have to go through that on a daily basis. And I would say, since last October 7th, it has felt more overwhelming than it had prior.
Yeah. Jeff, could you say just a tiny bit of how your relatives coped with that? Because a lot of, I mean, it sounds really important because a lot of people, I think, coped by not talking about it at all. And, but you must have gotten some education about it.
Yeah, so my grandmother on my mom's side, Rose Goldberg of blessed memory, she didn't like to talk about it, but she knew it was her duty. So she took a lot of speaking opportunities. She would tell my siblings and I stories of her survival. She was became the matriarch of her family at a young age after her father and some of her brothers were murdered, and her mom just was a shell of herself. And so this was a young teenager that was finding places to hide in the middle of the night, running 6 miles in the snow in between to bring people over the next night, and saving her newborn cousin, and people wouldn't let her in and things like that. So it was just, I got to hear a lot of the firsthand experiences from her, and those were probably the most impactful thing. I would say that my dad's father was, he dealt with a lot of guilt because he was one of 12 siblings to survive. And it sounds like your family member that came over early, felt that way. So very early on in the process, my grandfather got invited to study in Israel, and he, basically left the country in the back of a truck hidden, and made his way to Israel. And, his wife had a somewhat similar experience. Her family came over when she was young and moved over to Israel in the early side of the war. And so I think they both had some guilt that they dealt with there, but it also was a motivating factor for their efforts in fighting for Israel's independence.
Wow. My just to share a bit more of family history, but it sounds like, while it was difficult for your grandmother to take these speaking engagements, it probably kept her healthier than just repressing it. Um, yeah. So my great grandmother um, came to Chicago actually in around 1880 from Russia. So they were immigrants from Russia, from running from anti-Semitism. But then in 1904, she moved to Palestine in order to die and be buried on the Mount of Olives, which is right outside of the gate of Jerusalem where the Messiah is supposed to come. And when the Messiah comes, everybody gets resurrected, and those people get resurrected first somehow or other. So I've had relatives in Palestine since 1904, and it's been very much several of them fought in the War of 48 also. And so it's heartbreaking to see what's going on now because I do feel like um, we've squandered an incredible opportunity, we meaning the Jewish people, to really treat the Arabs fairly and to try to set up a different kind of a model of cooperation. And so now we see the incredible cruelty of the war on both sides. It's just really heartbreaking for everybody involved. And we are Maps Israel, which is an independent nonprofit, but similar missions is doing work with group therapy in Israel and trying to really pioneer that because the scale of the trauma is so great that individual therapy is really helpful to a lot of people, but there's so many people that need it. But we're also trying to train and have Maps Israel has trained Arab Israelis, Palestinians. We're really trying to bring MDMA assisted therapy to heal trauma on all sides of all different conflicts. Um, and just as an aside, just to say that we have managed to get bipartisan support in the United States. So
Yeah.
that's really, really critical as well. But I think this idea that when people are traumatized, one solution is to just not talk about it and try to move on. But that often sort of eats away at you inside if you can't really address that fully.
Yeah.
And so talking about it, and even us, the next generations that didn't have to deal with it directly are impacted. We work with Rachel Yehuda, a researcher at the
Mhm.
Bronx VA, and she's done studies of um, Epigenetics of Trauma. And this is sort of an explanation for multi-generational trauma. And it sounds like you may have inherited some of that, and me as well. That this, she's actually found markers on genes that it's epigenetics is what above the genes. It's what turns on certain genes. So genetic DNA evolution is extraordinarily slow over massive timeframes. But within one life, you can have these set points for anxiety, trauma that impact um, based on what's happened in your life, and then these get passed on to the children. So Rachel did a study, Holocaust survivors and their children, and identified some markers, epigenetic markers. And what she's looking at now is, can you change these markers with successful therapy, whether it's MDMA assisted therapy or any kind of therapy? If you process this trauma, will these epigenetic markers change? And I would say there's some preliminary evidence to suggest that that may be the case.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, certainly something that I think about, and have heard you speak a little bit on the epigenetics in the past, and it's something that has stuck with me. So I'm curious to see where her research leads.
Yeah, I think she's doing work with veterans, mostly at the Bronx VA, but she also has a psychedelic research center at Mount Sinai. And yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of really fascinating findings coming up over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where things shift. And to back us up a little bit, you mentioned sort of fear being a motivator, and trying to bring people together. Were there any specific experiences or specific experience in childhood where it really stuck with you, that you could give back and that you could try to bring people together? Was that something you thought about growing up?
I did. But here's one on this sort of theme. Now, this maybe is not
Yeah,
quite childhood, but this is when I was 16 years old. So yeah, not super young childhood, but
that counts. That counts.
okay, good. So this was a key, incredible lesson from my parents. So I mentioned that I was sort of scared and fearful about the Holocaust, but also about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fact that the U.S. and Russia could blow each other up and blow the whole world up, and we could all die that way, which seemed
Yeah,
like a reasonable fear.
yeah.
We came close. And since my great grandparents had come from Russia, I decided to study Russian in high school. And so I had 4 years of Russian. I went to Nutri East outside of Chicago in Winnetka, and it was a really, really good school. And so after my junior year of high school, my parents sent me to Russia with about 60 other high school students. This is now in 1970, height of the Cold War. And we spent the summer learning Russian and traveling around. And now, to answer your question, what happened is my parents um, put in my luggage two Jewish prayer books to bring to the synagogue at a time when religion was outlawed and prayer books were forbidden. And so, they taught me that there are these big, big factors that we can't really control, but you can respond to them. And if you can do something little, you should still do it, even if you can't affect the whole big system. So this whole idea that, in some ways it's incredibly pathetic to think about just bringing two prayer books to people at the synagogue, with millions of Jews unable to really access prayer books. But my parents really taught me that you need to be an activist. You need to do things to try to make the world better. And so when I did end up in Russia, um, I spoke enough Russian that I could communicate, and not great at all, but enough to communicate. And there's a bunch of young Russian kids working in the black market, teenagers similar or older, and we had the psychedelic '60s in America. They had total repression, and so they wanted to buy blue jeans with to look like America at big prices, and they would buy button shirts, and they would do all sorts of things that they would. One of the people that was with us on this trip had a album, Abbey Road, that they'd bought for like $2 or something, and so these black market people wanted to buy it. So me and two other guys sort of collected all sorts of stuff from the rest of the high school students, and we sold it to the black market and took our cut. And we made thousands of rubles. It was incredible. But rubles were worthless outside of Russia because they didn't want anybody to escape with money. So I went to the synagogue and near the end of the trip, and I said, I've got these prayer books and I've got this money to give to you. And this guy communicated to me in Russian. He said, well, this is important, but don't give it to me here because we're under observation. But meet me at this subway station at this time, at this place, and we can make this transfer. So keep in mind, I'm 16 years old and I'm thinking, oh, good. Now I'm James Bond. This is going to be really fun. And I thought, hey, I'm just a stupid little kid. If they catch me, they'll just send me home. That's at least what I thought. And so I did it. I ended up meeting this guy in the subway and making this transfer. And I think it all really started this, sense of activism that my parents taught me at this relatively young age. That was when I had this obligation. I'll also mention Primo Levi, who was a Holocaust writer, a Holocaust survivor, and he was incredible. My dad really admired his work, and we had Primo Levi's books. And after my dad died, I decided to read some of them, and so I learned something really important from Primo Levi, from The Drowned and the Saved is his book. And there was this passage, and this gets sort of the heart of my motivation, but I didn't realize it till recently. But he talked about how people think that the revolutions begin from the downtrodden and that they throw off their chains and they revolt, and that's how we have progress. But he says that almost never happens, really, because the whole purpose of oppression is to make it so people can't do it, can't revolt. It doesn't take that much repression to make people, back down to just struggling for survival. And he said that actually the revolutions really start with people with privilege. And he even spoke about in the concentration camps, there was an effort in one of them to blow up the crematoriums to slow down the massacres. And that resistance was done by the people that were, I can't remember what their name was, but they were the ones to shovel the bodies into the crematoriums. But they were doing lots of hard work, and so they were better fed and had a little bit better energy. And so even in that context, it was the privileged that, helped spark this fighting back. And so I think that is an obligation for those of us that do have certain privileges. And I would say most Americans or many Americans are in that position compared to others in the world, that not only do we have the opportunity, but we have the responsibility to really work towards what in Judaism we call tikkun olam, towards the repair of the world. So I just think what's really imperative on those of us that have that ability, that mobility, or that flexibility even, that we need to really take care and speak out for those that don't have a voice or that don't have the ability to do it. And so that's also sort of been my motivation to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a tremendous experience as a teenager in Russia. It sounds like it went as smoothly as it could have, thankfully. But I really appreciate what your parents were teaching, that like every little deed that you can do to help counts. I think about that sometimes. Like helping one person is helping a person, and that's a big deal.
Well, also this Jewish saying about to save one person is to save the world.
Yeah.
So I think that's true. And you never know the ripple effects of what you do either. I met Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He was the mystic of the United Nations. And he wrote this incredible book, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. Now, I read this in 1983, and it's the same kind of thing we're talking about. He feels that if people could recognize our commonality, our unity, this would be this global spirituality. He had a picture of the Earth from space on the cover of the book. And his idea was here that this sense of us being all part of this one Earth, that it didn't mean that global spirituality doesn't mean that there's one religion or that you have to give up your culture, your religion, your languages, your nationalities. None of those things have to be surrendered. In fact, you can appreciate differences even more once you understand commonality. And he talked about this sort of the transformative power of understanding the interconnectedness. And I wrote him a letter, and I said I read your book and it was terrific, but and you say how critical it is, this global spirituality, but you didn't mention anything about psychedelics, which can help us understand spirituality. And I said, would you help us bring back psychedelic research? And to my astonishment, he wrote me back. And he said, yeah, he agreed with what I said and he would help. And he referred me to a bunch of mystics from all sorts of different religions, including Rabbi Zalman Schachter, who was part of sort of Jewish renewal movement. And I got to know Zalman and ended up sharing MDMA with him for his wedding present. And
Wow.
he even permitted me to do MDMA in temple on Yom Kippur.
Wow.
Yeah.
How was that?
Well, that's when he had his congregation in Philadelphia.
Uh-huh.
And, I felt like MDMA and atonement go great together.
Yeah.
Yeah. It made it, more meaningful of a day.
If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I just thinking on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, growing up, it was, I really didn't like it. It was spending basically 2 days, at least for my family, basically 2 days at synagogue and, the fasting and atoning for your sins and talking about whether you're going to be put in the book of life or the book of death for the year. And that was always scary. So to think of how that might have changed, not that I needed it as a kid, but just what an experience might be like on MDMA, in that realm sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it was because you take it more to heart, I would say. You settle into the moment. That's the other part of MDMA. You kind of settle into the moment. You read it as if you're reading it for the first time, even though you read it same thing more or less every year, over and over and over. And it has this element of emotional release also. And so I felt it great. The funny part was, though, that I felt a little bit of guilt because MDMA takes away your hunger and you're supposed to be fasting on Yom Kippur. Um, so I dealt with that guilt and I felt overall, it was a worthwhile trade-off. But I do think that a lot of the rituals, and just to add this other point, is that, and why I got so interested in psychedelics also, this explains maybe a bit of the motivation as well from what you asked before, was that I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And I had this idea that somehow or other, my bar mitzvah would turn me into a man.
Right.
That's what you're told. This is this rite of passage. And all of a sudden, something's going to transform. You're going to have some spiritual sense of where you fit into the world. And as it ended up, I remember the morning after my bar mitzvah, waking up in bed, and I'm like, "Hey, I'm the same. I am not. This didn't help me go through the awkwardness of adolescence, or this didn't make me more emotionally open or less frightened of girls, or whatever. It just, I was the same, and it, every morning I woke up, I was like, I'm the same. When is this going to happen? When is something going to change? And so, a week went by and I realized if I was on any list, a whole new crop of boys and girls had been bar and bat mitzvah, and I had dropped off the list. It just wasn't going to happen. And then when I was 17, almost 18, is when I tried LSD. And that's when I thought, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Who am I? Where do I fit in? What is this larger world? What courage? I need courage to kind of let go into the unknown. And it just felt like, these rites of passage, I think, were really significant for people in the thousands of years of our history. But for many people in America in particular, the bar bat mitzvah is mostly a party, and has lost this inner kind of emotional, spiritual transformation. power. And so I think that's why a lot of people gravitate towards psychedelics. It's our own cultural rite of passage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I 100% feel that. And so I want to go back a little bit. 16, you came back from this transformative experience in Russia. You talked about, trying LSD at 17. Can you sort of walk me through the path of, that version of you and how you ended up getting to where you started MAPS?
So when I was 17, one of the key confrontations that I had to face was what to do about the draft. And I felt that Vietnam was really a mistake. It wasn't good for the Vietnamese. They were trying to throw off oppression. Um, it wasn't good for America. It just was a misunderstanding of everything between the U.S. and the Russians, and this was more, I felt, to me at least, more of a civil war than like an expansion of communism, in the sense that the South Vietnamese was also a dictator that we were supporting. So I decided to really think carefully about what I needed to do, and ended up studying Gandhi and Tolstoy and others about nonviolent resistance. So I decided not to register for the draft. When you're 17, you have to send in a postcard if you're a boy to register for the draft. And I thought, okay, this is the very first way they get you to cooperate. If I don't send this postcard in, they'll come get me, they'll put me in jail, and I'll cost the system money, and that will be my protest. Because I had a passport, I had a social security number, I was paying taxes, I had a driver's license, I was, in high school, I couldn't have been on I was on every possible list I imagined that you could be on. And yet, and so at that early age, I realized that what is moral and what is legal are two different things completely. And that much of what is illegal is also immoral, but not all of it. A lot of it is, political in different ways. So I decided to be this draft resistor, and, to my surprise, nothing ever happened. It's like they didn't even notice. I was just like, okay. So then I decided, I had this big ethical dilemma. Should I turn myself in order to go to jail, in order to cost the system money? But I remembered Buckminster Fuller had said something really interesting, which was that to make change, it's not that that you really can argue against what is. You have to create a better alternative, and then that will make the old systems obsolete. So I thought, okay, instead of volunteering to go to jail, that I'll just try to create a better world, and that's where I started these experiences with psychedelics. So it was really at 18 that I was doing psychedelics. I had the confusion that the more psychedelics you take, the faster you evolve. I completely, I didn't have elders to teach me really much.
Yeah.
I didn't really know. And so I completely undervalued the whole importance of integration. And just did a lot of psychedelics, and ended up getting more and more confused. I get more and more frightened, more and more confused.
Yeah.
It was the wrong approach.
And, as someone that myself, I've been a drug policy advocate for, maybe 10 years or so. And certainly like the biggest concern I have is that people are just going to go, do these various substances, not educate themselves, not integrate, have bad experiences, etc. So it sounds like you learned that sort of the hard way.
Very much. Well, I also had learned about John Lilly, um, who had created the flotation tank. He invented, it was called the sensory deprivation tank. Now it's been sort of rebranded in a more positive way as a flotation tank. But I learned about his work. He wrote this incredible book, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, about his work doing LSD in the tank, funded by the Navy, of all things. And so we tried that, friends and I, of isolation. And we just got, or me in particular, got more scared. And finally, out of my confusion, I went to the guidance counselor at college, and I said, help me with my tripping. This is in the middle of my freshman year. And luckily, the guidance counselor took me seriously, and he gave me this book to read, which was Realms of the Human Unconscious: Observations from LSD Research by Stan Groff. And this will lead directly to MAPS, you'll see. So this was now, I'm 18 years old, and this book was not published till 1975, but my guidance counselor gave it to me in 1972 in manuscript copy that he had gotten from Stan. Unbelievable.
I mean, that's more than coincidence. I would think that you ended up with that counselor.
Yeah. And so I read this book, and this is what it all put together for me. This was about sort of a scientific validation of these unitive mystical experiences and the structure of the unconscious, but it also had a reality check that for me was critical, which was therapy, meaning real issues. Can you help people lead fuller, richer lives and move away more from fears and anxieties to love and connection? And so you could have all these, theories about realms of the unconscious and all of this. And, you could get lost in that. We somehow call that now spiritual bypassing in a way that you can sort of get so wrapped up in this other realms that you don't pay attention to, what we need to do with our own lives, with our own egos. And so this book really put it together for me. And I read it, and what I realized was that this whole stream of psychedelic research that had been among the most important things going on in psychiatry, starting in the middle to late 50s and into the 60s, had been completely suppressed, and it was really being shut down. And I thought, this is something for me to work on through this privilege. This is what makes sense to me. I will work to start to bring back psychedelic research and prepare myself to be an underground psychedelic therapist, which I felt, when I told my parents that I wasn't going to register for the draft and anticipated going to jail, they were sympathetic, but they said, you're never going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, because you'll have a felony conviction. And I said, all right, I'll just have to pay that price. So then when I read Stan's book, I thought, aha, I could be an underground psychedelic therapist, and nobody's going to ask me for my license for that, because there is no license for that. And I asked my guidance counselor if I could write to Stan. And he said, sure. So I wrote this message to Stan, what do you advise on how I should try to become a psychedelic therapist one day? So here he's 44 years old, MD, PhD, leaving Johns Hopkins because the research has been shut down. I'm this confused 18-year-old kid, and I write him this letter, and he writes me back, and he encourages me. So I ended up meeting him at a workshop that he gave with Joan Halifax, Roshi Joan now, who he was briefly married to then, and that really set me on the way. So, but I realized that I wasn't mature enough, and I ended up dropping out of college and spending 10 years trying to get integrated, trying to do through construction, through building things. I figured, if I have all these ideas in my head, how do I get them out into the world? And so I did a lot of work on that. And finally, I felt that I was ready to go back to college. After 10 years, I felt grounded enough. I felt ready to go back to college. And as it turned out, New College in Sarasota, Florida, permits you to do off-campus study. So I went to Esalen for a month-long workshop in what Stan and Christina Groff called the Mystical Quest. And that's where I learned about MDMA. So I learned about MDMA when it was both quiet. It was legal, not illegal, but it was legal. And it was quietly used as a therapy drug under the code name Adam. But it had also started leaking out into becoming a party drug under the name ecstasy. So it was pretty clear that it was doomed. But I said, I realized about LSD after the backlash. Now I'm realizing about MDMA before the backlash. And therefore, I can get politically involved right now. And so that's led to the formation of a nonprofit before MAPS that I used to organize the psychedelic community's struggles to try to prepare to keep MDMA legal as a therapy drug once the Drug Enforcement Administration moved against it. And we did that, and we ended up winning in the courts, winning in the court of public opinion. Zalman was willing to speak anonymously, though, to the Washington Post. He compared MDMA to the Sabbath. It was
Interesting.
great. Brother David Steindl-Rast said a monk spends his whole life learning to achieve the enlightened attitude you can get from MDMA. What he didn't mean is that you should just give up meditation and do MDMA. He meant that if you get this feeling this quietness in your mind, this depth from MDMA, then later in your own meditation practice, you can learn how to sort of move towards that,
Yeah.
as part of this integration process. So, as it turned out, the DEA administrative law judge said, yes, MDMA should be illegal for non-medical purposes, but it should be legal for therapy. And in Schedule 3, and the administrator of the DEA rejected that recommendation. And it was clear to me that then no legal means were going to work, that I had to work through the FDA. And that's where I created MAPS in 1986 as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company to try to go through the FDA.
Yeah. Wow. And it's been nearly 40 years and you are still working on it. I mean, if there's anything that I've ever been impressed with you and MAPS, it's how long you've been able to stick to it. I think it's just tremendous. And the amount of change that you've brought forward already, the amount of lives that you have changed by these efforts and by the other people that you've catalyzed is truly remarkable. And I just, really want to commend you on it.
Yeah, thank you. It's been particularly difficult more recently. More recently, it's been the hardest of all, I would say, both because we've never been so close, and we thought that the FDA would approve MDMA assisted therapy. We had two tremendously successful phase 3 studies, the design of which we negotiated with FDA in a special protocol assessment process. But in the end, through all sorts of questions, and new people at the FDA took over from the ones we had negotiated with on the phase 3 design, and through, I think, mistakes that our pharmaceutical company made by acting as if MDMA was a traditional pharmaceutical, and you just didn't need to engage the political aspects of it. You didn't need to explain what you're doing to anybody. So I felt that there was both internal limitations and external pressure from new people at FDA. So we ended up, as many people have heard, FDA rejected MDMA assisted therapy for
Yeah.
PTSD. And so that was really, really painful and frustrating. And so what can you do? You just got to keep working. So I felt, at this point, 38 years. So if it's 38 and a half years now, if it's 40 years, whatever, doesn't really matter. I mean,
Yeah.
it matters for those people that have PTSD that needed it. That's the tragedy.
Yeah, it really is. And, I can't relate to, nearly 40 years of fighting for this, but even just having spent the last 8 or so years trying to get medical cannabis passed in my original home state of South Carolina, and the people that are suffering because of the politics there, it's frustrating to see this play out. And I can imagine some of that pain. But just still that you stick to it is incredible. And so, after, what is sort of the next step there? How do we move forward?
Well, here's this irony now is that, Trump has now appointed RFK Jr. to be the head of Health and Human Services. Whether he gets that job or not, I don't know. Jim O'Neill has been appointed deputy director of Health and Human Services. I know Jim from years ago. And these are people that are sympathetic with psychedelics. And so I think what we need to do now is to recognize that there are opportunities potentially for progress related to psychedelics. And so there's negotiations going on now between Lycos, the pharmaceutical company that MAPS launched, but now we only own about 40% of it. So it's really, we have investors, and it's a balance between public benefit and return to shareholders. And there's going to be some necessary negotiations with FDA about whether a new phase 3 study is needed or not. I don't think it should be. And I think maybe some of the new people at in the Trump administration will agree with that, and we'll see. So I think what we need to do is go forward with the research that's happening around the world and in the United States. There's one study that's called an investigator-initiated trial. It's happening in the U.S. It's particularly relevant for Trump, I would say. It's psychoanalytically informed MDMA-assisted therapy for pathological narcissism.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you can see, you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can find it. So it's an actual study. So, how are you going to get pathological narcissists to volunteer for the study? I don't know. To be known as a pathological narcissist is
Yeah.
probably something that people don't want to necessarily admit to in order to get into the study. But I think what we need to do is just really continue to try to help people suffering from trauma in a bipartisan way, and to continue this effort to try to take psychedelics and psychedelic therapy out of the culture wars and move forward, and then also to find out what kind of evidence the FDA still wants and provide that to them, and train therapists, including um, this more controversial part for some. I don't think it's controversial, but this idea that you train therapists who want to give MDMA or other psychedelics to their patients by having them experience those psychedelics themselves in a therapeutic context, so they know what the drug does. Now, some traditional psychiatrists will say, "Oh, I don't need to give myself electroconvulsive therapy to give it to my patients, or I don't need to take antipsychotics to give it to my patients." And my answer to that is, you're right. You're totally right. But in that case, the antipsychotic is the medicine, the electroshock, electroconvulsive therapy, that's the medicine. But with psychedelic therapy, the therapist is part of the medicine, is part of the
Yeah.
treatment. And so therefore you will know more about what your patients are going through and what it takes for you to have gone through it as well. And so that's why I think that part of the training is really important. So I think we just persevere and bring healing to wherever we can. That's why I'm going to Poland tomorrow. Is to try to bring MDMA assisted therapy training to therapists in Poland and Ukraine. And I don't think I'll get to go there this trip, but my grandfather came from this town called Stuchin, which is a bunch of quite a far north east of Warsaw. So I've never been there, but it's going to feel in some ways like going back to where my family has come from.
Well, I hope that's a great experience. And, we've talked about kind of what next steps can be coming out of, this recent ruling. Um, and do you foresee, does it help that what Oregon and Colorado have started doing in terms of opening up psychedelics? And do you foresee, potentially a pathway like cannabis where we start going on the state level?
I do. I think that cannabis has really taught us a lesson, I think, which is that um, medicalization precedes legalization. That people have been enormously frightened about cannabis causing schizophrenia or lung cancer or different things like this, which cannabis does not cause lung cancer. It doesn't seem like it precipitates schizophrenia in people who, it can precipitate schizophrenia in some people who seem to be predisposed to it in some ways. There's been an enormous increase in cannabis use in the 60s, 70s, till today, but the base rate of schizophrenia has stayed the same, around 1% of the population, which suggests that cannabis is not a precipitating cause of schizophrenia, but maybe, but in any case, people have such enormous fears. And so when substance is medicalized, then you have people have access to it, and you can see that they have access to it without all the guns and violence that come from underground drugs, criminalized drugs. And also, um, people don't know what to believe, but if they talk to someone they know who is a medical marijuana patient and tells them it helped them, that changes their mind, not just about medicalization, but about legalization. So surveys have demonstrated that one of the most important factors of whether somebody is for marijuana legalization is if they know a medical marijuana patient.
Yeah.
So I think that if we get psychedelic clinics set up, and we are now already having that with well over 1,000 clinics in America, some people say well over 2,000 clinics for ketamine, S-ketamine, and some of them are providing generic ketamine. That the stories of healing are what's going to change people's attitudes. So I think we'll need a decade or so of psychedelic clinics before people are really ready. to do much more. So particularly with MDMA or LSD. So we do have Oregon's psilocybin initiative. Colorado was natural plant medicines, expanded it. It was on the ballot here in Massachusetts, and it went down to a pretty crushing defeat of 43% yes, 57% no. And even then, when the polling was done to see about adding MDMA, before the vote took place, it looked like that was a bad idea because people have this romantic attachment to plants, but when you start
Yeah.
talking about synthetics, they don't go for it. So I think we'll need psychedelic medicine approved by the FDA for a decade or so before we really move towards um, legal access for adults without having to have a condition. We also see incredible rise of psychedelic churches, which are
Mm.
happening all over the place with very little enforcement. So that's happening. But I do want to get back to cannabis just for a second. Is that there
Yeah.
was a recent New York Times article about a major victory that MAPS won against the FDA about our cannabis project. So we have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan from cannabis taxes, and it's to study 320 veterans with PTSD with cannabis. Now, cannabis is palliative, not curative, the way that MDMA assisted therapy can be. Um, at the same time, a lot of people find a lot of relief from cannabis for PTSD. So we want to do this study, and FDA for 3 years has blocked us from studying smoked marijuana and blocked us from studying vaporized marijuana and blocked us from having what's called self titration, meaning that patients adjust the dose. So the way people use cannabis for PTSD, they smoke different amounts at different times of the day, depending on how they're feeling. Generally they use it every day, but not always in exactly the same way. And the FDA wanted it standardized. Everybody should do it the same way at the exact same time, the exact same amount. Um, um, and then it's just been something that the more conservative people at the FDA blocked it. And so we had a formal dispute that ended up prevailing. And so we won on all the points. So now we can go forward with this cannabis study for PTSD. And it will be THC, high THC, 20% THC. We're importing from Canada because we don't like the supplies that come from the US National Institute on Drug Abuse. And then we'll do the study. So I think South Carolina is a pretty conservative state. What do you anticipate just is the rate of progress in South Carolina? I'm just curious how you see that.
I would say that if you polled the voters, we don't have ballot initiatives in South Carolina. I think if you polled the voters when we started 8 years ago, it probably would have passed. Now it would do so overwhelmingly if we had those. The problem is every 2 years, the Congress is changing in the state house. And so every trip, I go on, my colleagues go on. Karen O'Keefe from MPP has been huge there. Um, every trip, you're kind of reconvincing people. And to go back to what you said about people knowing someone involved, that's definitely been the biggest mind changer, right? Like we'll meet with a congressperson one year completely against it. It's a gateway drug, etc. The next year, oh, my, you know, sister-in-law's friend had such and such cancer and tried medical cannabis and it was super helpful. So now I'm on board. Um, so that does happen a lot, and we've gotten tremendously close there. My last trip before COVID lockdown in March of 2020 was at the State House. We thought we were going to get it that session, and then everything sort of blew up. A couple years ago, we got a vote all the way. We got through the Senate for the first time. We're preparing for a House vote, and basically got thrown out on a technicality that had already been discussed in Senate, but was an easy out. So um, I'm hopeful every year. The amazing proponent of the cause in South Carolina, Senator Tom Davis, he often thinks that it's the year, and I hope that it is. But you never know, and it's frustrating that we've got this particularly conservative, regardless of the side of the aisle, like state house, relative generally to the state constituency, which tends to be a little bit more open minded.
Well, I really applaud your continuing to keep on with the struggle because I think that's really what will turn the tide and make the difference is when people realize, I think even at the FDA for different things, when they realize that we're not giving up, that we're going to keep trying. Even, one of the big factors in government is that the government has a longer lifespan than any individual. And so they rely on delay as one of their major tactics. I mean, I would say that that is the Drug Enforcement Administration's key strategy is delay, delay, delay. And if you can keep going and eventually they realize, hey, these people are not going away. And not only that, but maybe they can train another generation so that we can keep this going, that then they're more willing to compromise and to make change. So I think it's that persistence that will, in the end,
Yeah.
produce this. And the other thing people have asked me, and this is a good question for you, Jeff, which is, how do you avoid burnout? Particularly when, you're not making much success, when you just struggle and struggle and struggle. And for me, the answer has been to refocus what's the definition of success. And for me,
Hmm.
this definition of success is trying hard. And
Yeah.
if I try hard, then I've succeeded. Because whether it works or not is beyond us. It's beyond any individual. It's all these other factors. So how is it that you don't burn out when you've just described year after year after year of struggle and no success?
I mean, shamefully, I think that I do burn out. I've been getting burned out on the cannabis space and cannabis policy over the last, decade or so. And, I spent 7 years on the board at Marijuana Policy Project. And, I stepped down relatively recently. And part of that was burnout. Part of that was refocusing some of those efforts and time to combating anti-Semitism, which I feel is, important thing for me to do right now. But yes, I mean, each year you can see the direction that you're pushing things, as long as you're pushing them in the right direction, you can feel somewhat good about it. I mean, but the South Carolina stuff in particular has been tremendously frustrating, and it's hard not to get burnt out. But you look at people like Senator Tom Davis, who year over year continue to push regardless, because you think of the patients that are in need and that are suffering in South Carolina or that are leaving the state. And I've met many of them and I've met many of their families, and that's what keeps you going.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again that same sort of personal stories. For me, pretty much wherever I go, almost every day, somebody tells me a story about what psychedelics have done for them, and it's just so inspiring to hear. It's not this abstract thing; it's really impactful for people.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I agree. That certainly is what moves the needle the most. And, MAPS right now very much is mostly known for the efforts on the front of MDMA, for PTSD. And you mentioned some work in cannabis. Are there other substances and efforts that MAPS is working on right now that people don't hear much about?
Yeah, well, we're doing a lot in terms of advocacy and public education. And so, we're having Psychedelic Science 2025 is coming up June 16th to the 20th in Denver. The last Psychedelic Science conference that we had in June in 2023 had 12,400 people, which totally astonished us. It's at the Denver Convention Center. So I'd like to invite everybody who
Yeah,
wants
I
to.
was there. It was awesome. It
It,
was
it's,
it was incredible to see that many sort of psychedelic positive people in one place and what can be accomplished and the excitement around it.
Well, and we had bipartisan support. Again, we had Governor Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, speak, and then former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, Republican, came and spoke. It was incredible. One of my favorite moments of the whole conference was backstage with Governor Polis, and we're watching Rick Perry speak. And he comes and whispers to me, "How much did you have to pay that guy to speak?" And I'm like, nothing. He believes in it. He's speaking because he's speaking for free because he believes in it. It was fantastic. So we do education, we do advocacy work. So we do try to help with states and localities, local cities, and things that want to decriminalize or make psychedelics the lowest enforcement priority. We do a lot of educating of now first responders, and if they encounter people with difficult psychedelic trips. And then globally, I am interested, although we're not doing anything right now, although we have in the past with Ibogaine. I think if we can, but I'm waiting for state money. Maybe will come from Texas or elsewhere because I'd rather work on Ibogaine to try to develop it with open science, with no patents, into a generic medicine for opiate and fentanyl dependence. I think that would
Mm.
be incredible. And then with MDMA, we're doing things that people may not realize. So we're starting to look at MDMA for couples therapy. which is not monetizable in the same sense that it's not so clear that FDA would ever approve MDMA for couples therapy, but it's one of the very best uses of MDMA. And we're interested in global humanitarian projects. So we have a project in Somaliland, of all places, where we've had Canadian MDMA sent down there, and it's for training of the therapists. And now they're getting ready to design a PTSD study. We're doing group therapy research in Israel through MAPS Israel and others. And we're trying to do training of therapists in Ukraine and Poland, as I mentioned. In Denmark, there's a project we're hoping to see move forward with Syrian refugees in Denmark with PTSD. And so there's a lot that MAPS is doing that is separate from what our drug company is. Now, I can't even say our drug company. It's the drug company that we launched that is now controlled by investors, that is or majority owned by investors. And so MAPS is really just continuing in many, many different ways in many countries around the world to try to bring about a psychedelic culture that has integrated psychedelics in a pretty full way.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing to hear the work that you guys are doing and how it spans the globe. Only have a few more minutes, but I want to sandwich in a couple questions here. One, with Oregon recently sort of recriminalizing, what is your take on that? I mean, from my perspective, it's been frustrating to see the way some of these changes have been implemented, and people are reverting to sort of these old ways, and it's been sad to see.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I watched in the past was in Zurich, and they had what they called Needle Park, and it was by the railroad station, the main station in Zurich, and it's where they offered humane services to people addicted to opiates. And so they would have safe injection rooms, they would have harm reduction services. But what happened was that it was a rare, humane way to treat people, and opiate addicts came from all over Europe, and they overwhelmed the capacity of the locals to really deal with it. I think that's what something similar happened in Oregon, is that you have a policy that can work for the people that are there, but then people from surrounding areas come, and then the communities can no longer handle it. And then they react and say, oh, the policy failed. When I think actually the policy succeeded, but it should have been adopted by many other places so that you don't overwhelm an area that can't really handle the magnitude of the number of people coming in. And then people revert back to the old drug war rhetoric. And
Yeah, it's frustrating on that front, but I think you gave really good perspective on it. I like to think that despite things like that, we're still moving in the direction of ending the war on drugs, and gratefully to organizations like MAPS and Students for Sensible Drug Policy, where I've saw you speak one of my first times.
yeah, one of my favorite. I don't know. Did you see this speech where I talked about what I learned from my psychedelic experiences about how to
Yeah, I
continue?
believe so.
Oh yeah, that was fantastic. That was one of my favorite talks, and I think the Marijuana Policy Project deserves an enormous amount of credit for moving the marijuana issue forward. And thank you for being on their board. It was, they've been really pivotal for what's
Yeah.
been happening. I do only have about 1 or 2 minutes, though,
Yep,
unfortunately.
I appreciate it. I'm going to get in my last question that I ask every guest then. If you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
Well, I would end the war on drugs. I think that the war on drugs is fundamentally counterproductive. It doesn't help. It makes things worse. It creates enormous amount of money that goes into corruption, that goes into criminal gangs, that supports all sorts of groups that believe more in violence than anything else. And it treats people. We talked earlier about it's about the relationship you have with the drug. There's no such thing as good drugs or bad drugs. It's what is your relationship to that. And the war on drugs goes against that and says these are good drugs, these are bad drugs, and you can not have a good relationship with these drugs. So I think that's part of the problem. And if we were to switch, look at how much money is being made by taxes. Like our $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan is just a fraction of the money that Michigan is making from taxing cannabis. So that you then make it so that these things move above ground from underground. The governments can get tax money from it. You can have more open discussions about benefits of these drugs because now you're not trying to justify cruel prohibition. And I think it would make more access to psychedelics for people to have personal growth experiences. You don't have to have a diagnosis. So I think ending the war on drugs is probably one of the most important things that can be done in public policy to create a better world. It would demilitarize, deviolence,
Right.
and would respect people's autonomy.
And take away some of the shame too that people have when they do need help as well.
Well, and there's a lot of people that won't go for help if it's illegal.
Yeah.
Lots of people. So yeah, I
So
think it would have massive effect on public health.
Rick, thank you so much for your time. It's honestly was a dream to have you on the show. And the very last thing, how can people listening best support your work and your impact?
Thank you, Jeff. So, well, MAPS needs general operating support. So I would say go to maps.org and donate. I just been reminded I got to go to this fundraising meeting. So.
Best of luck. Wishing you the best. Look forward to being in touch soon.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thanks for checking out this episode of People Are the Answer. For more information, go to peoplearetheanswer.com. Please like, subscribe, rate, whatever you can do on various platforms. We really appreciate the support. And if you're interested, check out my other podcast, The Late Game Podcast. You can learn more at thelategame.com. Thanks.